Hello, beautiful people! Welcome back to my channel. Sorry. If you're new around here, welcome, welcome, welcome. We talk about all things history, and today's video you might find to be pretty interesting. I found it to be very interesting because, marriage, divorce has never been pretty, even in modern times, let alone 4,000 years ago. So I don't want to say too much because I don't want to give spoilers for, what civilizations and eras we're going to be bouncing around from. But we're going to take it way back, even before Jesus' time and the Ten Commandments, even before then, and Socrates, even before that. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about kind of what marriage and I guess romance, not really, because romance doesn't really exist when you trade your wife for like a piece of silver. But without further ado, let's get into the debauchery, as Kenny JD says. I love Kenny JD. Shout out to Kenny JD. 4,000 years ago, in a city of mud brick and moonlight, a woman stood before a scribe. In the city of Ur, near the Euphrates River, was a scribe who was about to write down something that had, until that moment, been forbidden to put into words: the end of a marriage. Not because one of them had died, not because a god had supposedly intervened, not because a family had collapsed in war. They were simply finished. A marriage was to be dissolved. The scribe present that day pressed a reed into wet clay, recording the names of those in the dissolving marriage, as well as the property, the sum owed. And then he pressed into the tablet the first permission the written ancient world had ever given to two human beings: the ability for them to both walk away from a vow. Today we're going to follow that tablet and the permission it gave across 4,000 years of law, religion, empire, and revolution. We'll meet the kings who wrote divorce into stone, the priests who tried to write it out, the wives who outlived their husbands' laws, and the reformers who, inch by inch, turned the privilege of men into something closer to a right for all. Because the story of divorce is not just about the end of a relationship between two people, it's the story about who, in any given century, was finally allowed to say, I don't want to do this anymore. To understand what the first divorce was really like, you have to understand the first recorded marriage in history. In the fourth millennium before the Common Era, the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, what the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, became the first place on Earth where human beings lived in large permanent cities: Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Ur. As you can imagine, an ancient city, aka an area of space crowded with people, required different things than villages. Cities needed something villages had never really needed. They needed records, they needed laws, they needed a way to decide whose child inherited whose field, whose debt was owed to whose temple, and whose grain belonged to whose clan. And so, marriage that had existed for tens of thousands of years as a private arrangement became, for the first time, a contract, a legal instrument, an understanding of reasonable expectations till, as the saying goes, death do us part. A Mesopotamian marriage was not about romance. It was an agreement between two households. The groom's family paid a price for a bride, the terahatum, to the bride's father. The bride's family provided a dowry, the shiriktu, which remained, importantly, the wife's property. Witnesses were called, a scribe was summoned, and clay was inscribed. Once the contract was sealed, the husband held most of the power. He was the head of the household. He could take concubines as he pleased and sell a wife into slavery to pay his debts. If she was barren, he could toss her out like livestock. But because the marriage was still a contract, the ancient lawgivers had to decide what happened when a contract was broken or requested to be broken. They could have simply said marriages cannot end, many later civilizations would, but the Mesopotamians didn't, because in a world where marriage was property and property had rules, every contract needed an exit, so they wrote one. Around 2100 BCE, roughly 500 years before Hammurabi, 1,000 years before Moses, and 2,000 years before Caesar, a king named Ur-Nammu rose in the city of Ur. He was the founder of what historians call the third dynasty of Ur. And he did something no ruler, as far as we know, had ever done before. He wrote down his laws. The Code of Ur-Nammu, carved into stone, stelae, and copied into clay tablets, is the oldest surviving law code in human history. It predates Hammurabi, the Ten Commandments, and written philosophy. And in among its rules for murder, theft, and false witness are these lines among the oldest legal sentences any human being can read. If a man divorces his primary wife, he shall pay her 1 mina of silver. If he divorces a former widow, he shall pay her half a mina of silver. And here's a detail that astonished me when I first read it, and I think might be a little surprising to those listening, that the payment did not go to the wife's father. It did not go to the temple. It went straight to the wife. A mina of silver, roughly 500 grams, was hers to walk away with. In a culture where most people owed nothing, it was enough to begin a new life. The law was not equal. A wife could not simply divorce her husband in the same way. Keep in mind that up until the last couple hundred years, domestic violence and cheating were sometimes, in some cultures, the only way women could get out of divorce. In certain cultures, the request for divorce from the woman had to be both a result of infidelity and domestic violence. A wife in ancient Mesopotamia who was wronged could, however, petition. A wife who was unjustly accused of a divorceable action by her husband could, under Ur-Nammu, see her accuser punished and her name restored. In the first ever written law on earth, divorce is two things, unequal but possible. 3 centuries later, in Babylon, a king rose who would carve his laws into a pillar of black diorite, 7 feet tall, and set it in public square for all to read. His name was Hammurabi. If you watched my previous video on personal injury, you probably remember this guy. A famous saying from him goes, an eye for an eye. Hammurabi reigned from 1792 to 1750 BCE. His code contains 282 laws, and roughly 60 of them, a fifth of the entire code, are interestingly about marriage, family, and divorce. I think this tells us something important, that Hammurabi's Babylon was a commercial empire. Its courts heard cases, Babylonian women owned property, and marriages could be dissolved. Under Hammurabi, a husband could still initiate divorce more easily than a wife. If he wanted to leave, he returned her dowry, paid a separation fee, and she went. If she had borne him children, she kept custody of the younger ones, and he paid maintenance, nowadays known as child support, until they were grown. But Hammurabi also did something the later world would take 3,000 years to rediscover. He allowed a wife to initiate divorce. Law 142 of the Code of Hammurabi reads roughly, if a woman hates her husband and says, "You shall not have me," her circumstances shall be examined. If she has been careful, and there is no blame on her, and her husband has been going out and neglecting her greatly, the woman has no blame. She shall take her dowry and go to her father's house. A woman could say, "You shall not have me." A woman could, if the court believed her, walk away. The law did not make it easy. The court could still rule against her, and in some readings condemn her harshly. But the statute exists. In the second millennium BCE, in a patriarchal empire, A woman's no was written into stone. Unfortunately, we did not see another legal system as generous to wives as Hammurabi's for nearly 4,000 years. And this is just a little side tangent before we get into the next little bit of information, but I have this written down because I don't want to get this wrong. But for those who don't know, I believe here in America, at least where I'm based out of, no fault divorces didn't come about until roughly the 1970s. And there's still ongoing debate about that today, which is insane. For those who don't know, no fault divorces are essentially when you divorce somebody without, essentially having reason to. As I kind of touched on earlier, during Hammurabi's time, you had to, in a lot of cases, prove that you were domestically abused or cheated on or neglected in some way. And women didn't get the right to just be like, hey, I'm sorry, I don't like you anymore. I want to start my life. I don't want to do this anymore. Until the 1970s. And there's still many societies today which don't even have rules like that. Obviously, where women, barely have rights to begin with. So it's just kind of insane. It makes me grateful to be alive today. And all this is just to say that if you have a girlfriend, mom, sister, grandma, an important woman in your life, you should make sure you show her a little love. Okay, now back to Babylon. So, you have the Babylonians over here writing their little laws into wet clay. And then another civilization about 1,000 miles west was quietly doing something even more radical. In ancient Egypt, marriage was not a religious sacrament. It was not strictly speaking a legal ceremony. A man and a wife moved in together, declared themselves married, and crucially signed a marriage contract that spelled out what each would bring in, what each would own, and what each would receive if the marriage ended. Egyptian women could own property in their own names. They could inherit, they could sue in court, they could testify, they could run businesses, and they could divorce. Surviving papyri. Papyri, I like saying that. Surviving papyri from the first millennium BCE shows marriage contracts with explicit divorce clauses, often specifying that the woman keeps her dowry, a share of the household property, and in many cases, a fixed alimony for years afterward. In one late period contract, the husband promises his wife that if he leaves her, he will pay her a set weight of silver every month for the rest of her life. Egypt, more than any other ancient civilization, treated divorce as a mutual unwinding of a mutual agreement, not as a punishment or a scandal, but as a closing of a door that both hands had opened. When the Greeks arrived and conquered Egypt under Alexander and Ptolemies, they were, according to their own chroniclers, scandalized. In Greece, a wife was a household possession, but in Egypt, she was a signatory. The Romans inherited much from the Greeks, but when it came to divorce, they went their own way. In the Roman Republic, marriage was sine manu, literally without hand. The wife did not pass into her husband's legal power. She remained under her father's guardianship, or if he died, often became ciu ius, a legal person in her own right. Her dowry remained, in a legal sense, recoverable, and either spouse either could end the marriage at will with a simple declaration, Toi seres tibi habetu. I'm so sorry for my pronunciations, I'm trying my best. By the late Republic, divorce in Rome was so common among the elite that Cicero complained his friends kept remarrying before he could remember the names of the last wives. Roman women divorced men, men divorced women, reasons were offered or not, property was returned. Children generally stayed with the father's family. That cost was real, but the marriage itself simply ended. For 5,000 years, in the largest empire the West had ever seen, divorce was a private matter between two adults. And then, in the 4th century, something happened that would close that door for more than 1,000 years. In 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. By 380, it was the official religion of the empire, and Christianity brought with it a radically new idea about what marriage was. For the Christian theologians of the late empire, Augustine in particular, marriage was not a contract, it was not a civil arrangement, it was a sacrament, a visible sign of an invisible grace, a reenactment on earth of Christ's union with his church. And sacraments cannot be undone. By the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian had begun rolling back Rome's divorce laws. By the early medieval period, the Western Church had taken jurisdiction over marriage away from secular courts entirely. To be married was to be bound for life by God. There were exceptions. The Church permitted annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never, in its sacramental sense, truly existed. But divorce, in the sense that Babylonians and Romans had known it, the clean severing of a valid union, was gone. For 1,000 years in most of Christian Europe, a woman trapped in a violent marriage had three options. She could endure, she could flee and be returned, or she could persuade a bishop that the marriage had been, all along, a legal illusion. The door, Namu, had opened 4,000 years earlier, was, for most of Europe, closed. In 1527, an English king had asked the Pope for an annulment. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had borne him one living child, a daughter. He wanted a son. He wanted specifically to marry a woman named Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused. What happened next is one of the greatest ironies of Western history. Henry VIII did not simply defy the Church, he broke it. He declared himself the supreme head of a new Church of England, and by that authority granted himself what Rome could not give. In doing so, he did not restore divorce, he did something more complicated. He proved that the sacramental theory of marriage could be overridden by political will, that a kingdom could decide for itself what marriage was. Scotland, Geneva, the Netherlands, parts of the Holy Roman Empire, one by one, they wrote divorce statutes back into civil law. It was narrow, fault-based, and was reserved almost entirely for the wealthy. But after a millennium of silence, the word divorce was legal again. The French Revolution in 1792 did something no European government had done since Rome. So now we're jumping to the French. It declared marriage a civil contract, entered and exited freely by two consenting adults. For 5 years, French citizens could divorce by mutual consent with no fault assigned. Very interesting. Thousands did. Women in particular flooded the courts. Unfortunately, Napoleon would get his little, you know what I mean, in there and would roll back a lot of that really progressive, honestly, for the time, statutes. And fast forwarding again to the 19th century, divorce laws spread across the Anglo-American world. By the 19th century, England allowed civil divorce in 1857, but a wife had to prove not just her husband's adultery, but her husband's adultery plus something else. It had to be adultery plus cruelty, incest, or desecration. In the case of a husband wanting to divorce a wife, he only had to prove adultery. So both the husband and wife were equal in name, but not in fact. In the United States, divorce law was left to the states. Migratory divorce, the practice of traveling to a more permissive state to end a marriage, became a minor industry in places like Indiana and later Nevada, where a 6-week residence in Reno could end a marriage that New York would have refused to end at all. Couples would stage adultery at a hotel so a photographer could document it. Pretty interesting, though. Can you imagine you and your husband or wife are like best friends, but you just don't have feelings for each other anymore, so you guys stage a little cheating scandal together? I don't know. What do you guys think? And speaking of America, did y'all know that governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, California governor, signed the Family Law Act, which created a legal concept that would, within 20 years, sweep across almost every state in most of the Western world. No fault divorce. Can y'all imagine? That's like Donald Trump, deciding to do something actually good. Uh, anyways, a marriage could end because it was, in the language of the new law, irrevocably broken. No adulterer had to be named. No cruelty had to be staged. Two adults, one of whom simply wanted out, could be granted a way out. 4,000 years after Ur-Nammu, the West had, in a sense, caught up to Babylon. When you take a step back and look at the whole 4,000-year arc that humanity had to go through just to give women equal rights to just say peace, every expansion of divorce has, in practice, been an expansion of women's freedom. Ur-Nammu gave women silver. Hammurabi gave women standing. Egypt gave women signatures. Rome gave women equal right to exit. And the Christian centuries took almost all of that away. I might get some heat for that sentence, but I'm a Christian, so I'm allowed to say, whatever I want. Sorry. That's how it works. Needless to say, we're in present day, so economists who have studied the rollout of no fault divorces across the United States have found that in the decade after each state adopted it, there was a significant drop, or significant drops, plural, in female suicide, domestic violence, and in women murdered by their husband. Not because divorce caused safety, but because the credible threat of exit changes what happens inside a marriage. There's a reason why every authoritarian movement of the 20th century, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Franco Spain, the Islamic Republic of Iran after 1979, has moved among its first acts to restrict divorce. The exit is the equality. Divorce is not the opposite of marriage. Divorce is the thing that makes marriage, the modern consenting, mutual version of it, possible at all. A vow you cannot leave is not a vow, it is a cage with a ceremony. Sorry, I just felt like, really enunciating those words because I just finished The Testament season 1. And if you have not heard of or watched The Handmaid's Tale or read the book, y'all should get caught up on that if you're interested in this video because I think a lot of the ideas are very relevant to that series in general. The Testaments is a part 2 to The Handmaid's Tale. The tablet we started with, the one pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago in the city of Ur, does not survive. What survives are its descendants. Copies, translations, oral storytelling passed down from generation to generation. And luckily, these ideas of permission, consent, mutual agreement has made it to modern times. We now have, annulments, divorce proceedings, prenups, the like every single day happening within courtrooms all across the globe. In every marriage contract that spells out what each partner will keep, in every law that says to a trapped woman or a trapped man, you are not required to stay, the first divorce in history was not a failure of love. It was one of the first byproducts of autonomy, especially for women. And the slow, uneven 4,000-year story of divorce law is, in the end, the story of more and more human beings, women first and most of all, being handed a means to forge their own paths. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I know the title was a little clickbaity because you might have clicked on this thinking you were going to hear about a particular man or woman who divorced in Mesopotamia, but unfortunately, we do not have written documents that are, accurate to say, oh, this couple was for sure the first couple, Adam and Eve, to ever be divorced or go through a divorce together. That's just not something that we have recorded in history because you got to remember a lot of history is recorded through means of wall sketches, clay objects like pots, pans, and most importantly oral storytelling. um Fun fact, most of midwifery, aka women who helped assist in births throughout early ancient history, would pass down their knowledge orally because like I said before, we didn't really have written laws or traditions until around Hammurabi's time, at least that we know of. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. I do apologize if I got anything wrong in this video or if I was kind of all over the place. Um, I tried my best. But, feel free to correct me in the comments or give me feedback on what you liked, what you didn't like. If you thought I should just like shut up because, I go on side tangents a lot. My brain is just always working a million miles per minute. I get that. You're probably getting into the story or into the storytelling, and then you're like, bro, like, why are you going on this tangent? I get it. I'm going on a tangent now. My God. Yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day. And yeah, I'm feeling more motivated to make videos. I have another idea coming up. I'm working on the script for that. These scripts do take a little bit of time because, you know, I just want to make like a cohesive story. My brain is a jumbled mess, and if I didn't have this written down and me like looking over to the side, y'all, I this video would make no sense whatsoever. I promise you. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day. Bye. Peep my Lego collection.